unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Amy Whitaker, who is in the Arts Administration Department. Is that a department? You teach Arts Administration at New York University, and also the author of a couple books. This one right here called Art Thinking: How to Carve Out Creative Space in a World of Schedules, Budgets, and Bosses. Then you got this book called The Economics of Visual Art, and the story of NFTs, which hopefully we'll get to. Welcome, Amy.
Thanks so much, Greg. So happy to be here.
Well, this book, Art Thinking, I was having trouble kind of pinning it down, right? Because in a way, it's you're trying to teach business to artists, right? But you're also kind of trying to teach art to business people. And I think most people don't think of these things as being very closely related, but it's hard when you read the book to not see most of what you're trying to convey as, I think, essential, not kind of incidental, but essential to what it means to be a successful business person in the modern world, right? I mean, you set up this contrast at one point where you said that, business is about strength and art is about flexibility. And I think maybe you're thinking like the business of yesterday, right? The stable business, the business that has a competitive advantage and it's kind of in rinse, wash, repeat mode versus this way of art thinking. And I think today, since every business is really a work in progress, since every business is constantly, morphing, it seems like every business person needs to essentially do art thinking. I mean, is that a fair thing to say? I mean, is the contrast kind of disappeared in today's world?
No, I love that. I mean, stop it some more, Greg. No, it's great to discuss that book with you because I think you are such a generalist and pull in all of those threads yourself. That book, Art Thinking, came out in 2016, and it was a labor of love for someone like me who has an MBA and also an MFA in painting, in that order. So I went to art school with an MBA, which is a social experiment and story for another day. But I think that what really hits differently and even more about that book now is that we are confronting an AI moment, a fulcrum moment in the AI story where it's a lot easier to automate the future based on the past, and it's a lot more uncertain to do that. We live in a world that is probably facing untemplated futures, these large things like climate and democracy that are working until they're not. And this idea, for me at least, that the world itself is our largest collective art project. So the big idea in that book was that if you're making a work of art in any area of life, literally in an art studio, on a Sunday afternoon, a project you believe in, or some frontier at work, you're not going from a known point A to a known point B, you're inventing point B. And when you're inventing point B, you don't have known reference points. So you're trying to move forward without a template. And there's something really difficult about that requires the mindsets of art, things I relate to from spending time in artist studios and working with entrepreneurs who have very successful entrepreneurs who have the capacity to go all in and then scrap it and start over. But also you need the tools of business. And the arts have a lot of examples where people have created value, but they haven't gotten a share of the upside they've helped to create. So that book is sort of interesting to look at now. I wrote about blockchain in that book in a manuscript I turned in 2015. And I think a lot of those tools of collective ownership, of cooperation, and the way that business is a process of moving forward without known reference points. Like Sarah Sarasvathy has written about effectuation. There's a whole movement. She wrote about that 15 years before that book came out. There's a huge business movement around effectuation. Sylvain Bureau, who works at ESCP in Paris and is a collaborator of mine, independently started an art thinking collective in France, where MBA students learn to make art projects in this system that operationalizes learning from different artist movements. And I think all of us need that. I think about that a lot when I realize I'm in a classroom as a professor teaching people who could answer everything with AI, and I could grade everything with AI. And what does it mean for all of us to rise to a moment that's different from that? And what is the dignity position of believing that everyone has something that's theirs to contribute? Everyone is capable of independent thinking. And to me, all of those things are temperaments and mindsets and muscles or flexibility that I associate with being an artist.
Well, I think at some point in the book, you speculated, what would Leonardo be doing if he were alive today? And, we think of him as an artist, first and foremost, but he was also a scientist. And I think most people would say that if he were alive today, he probably would have more in common with the Steve Jobs of the world or the Sam Altmans of the world than with, say, the Jeff Koontzes or the Maria Abramoviches. I mean, are these tech founders kind of the folks that we should think of as being the artists of our time?
So I think that's a really interesting and profound question to ask again right now, so many years after I wrote that book. At the time I wrote the book, I said that at the time that I wrote that book, I said that if Leonardo were alive today, Leonardo would not be one person, because it's not possible, even though you and I are both generalists and are devoted to trying to be human Venn diagrams and be the connective tissue in the body of knowledge and in our university working lives. I think it's very difficult to understand how an individual can have an impact on a lot of the problems we're facing. The thing I would say about Steve Jobs or Sam Altman is that I think there's a story of the heroic lone genius. And I think Leonardo would be probably more likely to be working in technology than in the visual arts narrowly construed. But I think that those are different kinds of stories. I think that there's an element of Steve Jobs that's being able to take a risk on the future. You see the same thing in stories of Scorsese making movies, that there's a temperamental ability to focus on the question and not operationalize to the outcome. But I think in the case of OpenAI, we have to talk, and the back half of art thinking is all about this. We really have to talk about the creative design of the business model, because I don't think that we're critical enough. And I don't mean critical as in judgmental. I mean critical as in skeptical and curious and working the problem Ed Harris Apollo 13 style. We're not talking enough about the business model of OpenAI. A company that was founded as a nonprofit realized they couldn't get access to capital, started a for-profit but profit-capped arm that's governed by the nonprofit as if it's good enough for society to say that a small group of privately appointed people running a nonprofit are in charge of what might be the upside that is generated by the collective intelligence of humanity. I mean, those are problems that democracy is equipped to solve. Those are problems that cooperative governance models, like the kind that Nathan Schneider writes about, are equipped to help us with. And I think that we're actually on a precipice, not just of like a invented point B world that's the AI future, but an invented point B world that's an invitation to think about what it really means to shift from a Web 2 to a Web 3 platform economy mindset, and whether that's possible. I think we have a lot of these companies I call Facebook and Twitter, but I'm supposed to call Meta and X, Alphabet and not Google, that I'm hugely reliant on and deeply respectful of the contributions of, but that are using the data of all of their customers. And OpenAI, I'm quite interested in and sympathetic toward these quixotic seeming lawsuits from people like Sarah Silverman toward Sam Altman, where they say, hey, I wrote that and I wrote it before anyone knew it was possible. And it may seem really obvious that it exists because of the labor I put into it. And that's where I think art has some stories to tell us and some ways of helping us think about the dignity of creative labor, the riskiness of it, and how we meld the mindset of art and the tools of business, the structural design of business to deal with that as a collective design problem, collective action problem.
Yeah, I really like this metaphor you use about the letter and the envelope, right? Where there's creativity both in terms of what you're delivering and how you deliver it, right? And that, business model can be an act of creativity and not simply the product.
Yeah, no, I love that you love that. That I always think of that when I teach business to artists, they often will say, I feel uncomfortable, like I'm putting on an itchy sweater of this 1.0 version of business that someone else has designed for me, and now I have to speak like a rapacious capitalist or just talk about myself whenever I go to parties. And I think that there's a way that people can understand business through their own ethos as a person, and in parallel can relate to art and creativity without feeling like they have to be, wearing a beret. That the letter is sort of like bringing your whole self to work and showing up in your particular way, and the envelope is kind of doing that structurally.
Well, I mean, it seems like if you're an artist, you can't ignore economics, right? I mean, the idea that you could just be in your studio and, making wonderful stuff and hope that somehow that's going to put food on the table. I mean, you can go to an extreme where it seems like some artists, some conceptual artists, seem like all they're thinking about is monetization, right? That's sort of coming at the expense of what we might think of as aesthetics, or at least they're turning the business model itself into the work of art. But I mean, can you be an artist in today's world and not have to think about monetization and becoming part of the market?
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge question. I think that as a person, you have to think about being a citizen and you have to think about being an economic actor. And I think that's true for artists. And I think it's that much more challenging for artists because artists are in a particular position of being both producers and investors, where they have to cover their day-to-day expenses, but they also have to take risk and to show us things are possible, where we are not able to perceive value until many years later. And that value is contestable. We wouldn't all agree on what it is. I think you're raising a separate issue that I'm sympathetic to and I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is kind of how insular is the art world? How many people are inherently creative who feel very cut off from the idea of art fairs, or why is that pile of canvas in the corner of the museum floor? I could do that. And I think that there's some real questions we have to ask ourselves within the art field. Is there too much incentive toward self-promotion or marketing and how art gets selected? Or is there codependency between the curator and the artist, where there's more work that's selected because it needs to be explained? But I tend to take what I think it's Chip and Dan Heath call a bright spots theory, where I just try to focus on the things that I find inspiring in the arts. So artists like Nina Cacciadorian or Lenka Clayton or bunches of other people, where there's such an animating curiosity to their practice. Lenka Clayton has work that's in a recent exhibition at the Cantor Arts Center at Stanford University called Day Jobs. That's a show about the jobs that artists have in order to support their practice and the way that those jobs help inform their practice. Nina Cacciadorian, who's an artist, curated a separate show called Day Jobs many years ago, and I think it's something we don't really talk about, which is just the economic necessity of stability and security and capital to be able to solve what I call the R&D problem, the research and development problem of paying to be able to explore and investigate and discover things before their value is known. Artists have to be able to do that.
I just got off an interview where I was talking about learning organizations. And so we in business, we love to talk about, organizations that are capable of learning, very quickly. But I think that's fundamentally different from being a creative organization, right? Because, learning organizations are responding very, very quickly to new things, whereas creative organizations are propelling things forward. I mean, I always think about that quote that Henry Ford had: "If I listened to the customer, I would have given them a faster horse," right? And I think you quote Steve Jobs, which is, he says, the customer doesn't know what he wants until you show it to him. If you're an artist and you're just sort of catering to the market, I mean, can you ever create great things?
I mean, I think you have to say it's possible to create great things while catering to the market. But the way I would take that question is to say being a creative company is probably not the same as being a learning company, in that being a learning company, you want 100% of the company to be learning all the time. And being a creative company, I think it's okay to see it more as a portfolio. Even for working artists are spending a huge amount of their time applying for grants and a smaller percentage of their time actually in the studio. So I like to think of creative work, this kind of inventing point B, speculative work, as the equivalent of an alternative asset allocation, where it's an affordable loss.
Correlation buster, right?
Yeah, exactly. 100%. Correlation buster, affordable loss, tuition you'd be willing to spend. And the metrics are, do I really think this is the right question to be asking? And how can I design high quality experiments to be learning as much within that? And it's a different kind of learning because you're setting the preconditions of what you're learning in response to, right? It's not just things happen and I'm a learning company. It's I'm going through this experimentation through their tools in the book, like studio time and grace periods to help structure that, but ways of doing activities that don't have to be controlled variable experiments, of course, they're probably not, but that are experiments, ways of moving forward when you're not sure what the solution is. It's a little bit different from design thinking, which I usually respect and teach actively. But it's a little different from having a stepwise way of getting to the best possible X. It's more question driven, where you go as far as you can see and then you shine the light again, and then you go as far as you can see and you kind of make your way like that.
Yeah, you even used the BCG matrix, right? With the cows and the stars and so forth. And so I think you're making the case that not just companies, but sort of every individual should have in their portfolio some studio time, right? Some artistic piece. I mean, how does one know the proper asset allocation? I mean, if we're going to use that metaphor, and you're doing asset allocation, what percentage should you? I mean, I use a similar metaphor when I talk about when I work with executives. A lot of times, they're interested in all sorts of stuff, but when you get down to time management and say, listen, you need to spend a certain amount of time doing reflection. You need to spend a certain amount of time doing nothing. And you had a lot of that stuff in the book. How do you know how much?
Well, the answer is 4, Greg. It's an excellent question. No, I have no idea. It's different for different people. I think when you write a book, how people will go, hey, what's the way that you wrote a book? And you're supposed to either say, I wake up at 4 and run 10 miles and then write for 2 hours every day, or, and I think that's different for everybody, depending on their life and their other commitments, and also the way their mind works. There's some people who can sit down and work for a half an hour at a time, and there's some people who need a half a day, or they need 3 days to roll into it on the third day. I think they're habits, things like the artist way, the morning pages, that Julia Cameron suggests that are generally helpful. But I think it really depends. I mean, you could easily say 80-20, or you could say 10%. I think 10% you see a lot in other suggestions of how people do side hustle. But I think it really depends on the organization and the person and what they can afford to lose. I think if you get to do it 2 hours once a month and you have $100 you can put in, there are artists who can do a lot with $100, and there are people who, feel like they need, or companies like OpenAI that need $10 billion to start to get the plane off the ground. So I think it is entirely situation dependent. I think it just depends on what's comfortable to you, so that you aren't going to feel like you have to get your money's worth, whether that's in time and resources or in cash.
Well, I mean, you used examples like 3M, where I forget the name of the guy who came up with the adhesive or whatever, the masking tape example,
Yeah.
and then, Google's 20% time. But one thing that I think most people have observed is that companies that have those kinds of initiatives, they tend to get squeezed out, right? I mean, I know a lot of people at Google who say 20%. Like, what are you talking about? I don't need 20%, right? If you want 20%, you got to tack it on top of the 100% that you're already doing. It does seem like there is an inevitability. There's like a pressure to squeeze out that room that is normally allocated for studio time or creative work.
Yeah.
Why do you suppose that is?
The modern market economy, and the attention economy, I think all of us feel that. So I would say that for me, if we're talking about time and not monetary investment, but time, I would find it easier to carve out a day or 2 days and to have that go at it, to really have my entire mental hard drive be devoted to something. And that in and of itself would give me information on how to touch that project again and move it forward after that. I've been rereading Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing. And I think on more of a daily basis, not feeling like you have to be productive on your 20% time project, but that you have things in your life that give you space to be in a different gear, not glued to your phone, which I'm glued to my phone as much as anybody. I think there's a passage in that book that's the idea of the New York City streetscape as an analogy, that you can't really change the asphalt, but you can plant gardens. So it's a question of kind of how to plant gardens, like how to start things and counterintuitively add things in order to be, more productive, not in the market sense, but productive in a kind of meaningful contribution sense as well.
Well, I think you said something also about metrics, right? And, we tend to overemphasize these kind of completion metrics rather than looking at some kind of intermediate metric, which would tell us whether we're on the right path. I mean, how do we do that? How do you know if the time that you're spending in work in progress is actually moving things forward or not? Like, you could just be wasting your time, right? I mean, how do you know whether you say, embrace the unfinished, embrace the work in process, but that could easily turn into just, dilettantism and time wasting, right?
Yeah, it could. I mean, the short answer and the cold comfort is you don't know, but that's also the beauty of it. So you do know, if you're pretending, like the pretending to write a book problem, where you're like, I'm going to go do creative work and sit in a room with my perfect new journal. And I think we all know if we're not really in the work, but so many stories of creative accomplishment, of what in that book are invented point B worlds, we know about them because they happened, but I think there's tremendous dignity to the before picture because there's so many people who we know now, but we could have just as easily known of in their before picture. Dr. Kariko, who received the Nobel Prize for the mRNA vaccine, if you had met her 10 years ago, you might not have known that that was her scientific accomplishment, right? So it's like you have to tell the stories from the after picture and then roll back to, well, would I feel good about being in the before picture, whether I succeed or not? One of my favorite stories in the book, and I have a number of favorite stories in that book, is of Thomas Fogarty of the winery in Northern California, who invented the balloon catheter and opened up or augured in the field of minimally invasive cardiovascular surgery because he was a self-professed juvenile delinquent who had to be busy or supervised, got a job in a hospital only because he was 13 and hospitals were exempt from child labor laws in Ohio at the time, and then figured out how to tie the pinky finger of a latex glove and a piece of urethral catheter together because he learned fly fishing knots cutting school. So he's like wasting time to go fly fishing. And then this ends up teaching his curious tinkerer mind how to do something when he's stuck as a teenager in an operating room, watching people with, sorry to be graphic, blood clot removal lose a limb or die. And he's like, there's got to be something better. And he's only able to do it at a time that no glue will connect those two substances because he wasted a bunch of time getting into trouble. And because he's willing to waste a bunch of time putting stuff together. I think that's one of the things that gives me a lump in my throat when I'm speaking about that book. I think about someone like Roger Bannister, who runs the first sub 4 minute mile. And he just happens to do that on one day in 1 4-minute period of time, right? And he's only able to do that because in that moment when he doesn't know if he'll succeed or fail, he's giving it absolutely everything he has and then some. That's what's so beautiful about the possibility of artistic creative effort in any area of life. But he could have easily failed and there could have been dignity in failure. There's scientists all over the world who are saying, no, there's no cure for cancer here. And I'm grateful to every single one of them. And I think the metric is, did you ask the research question that you meant to ask? Did you have to over-design it for the grant review board, or could you find the scale at which to operate and to do that?
Well, it seems like, the Fogarty story, you talk about whole life, living and thinking. It seems like you learn things in a lot of different domains and you kind of file them away, but you file them away in such a way that you can easily retrieve them when needed, right? And you don't know how it's going to be needed or how it's going to be used. Is that what we mean when we talk about being a generalist, sort of hoovering up things from a bunch of different domains, but without any kind of specific plan?
Yeah, I think there are probably so many different ways to be a generalist, but one of the ones I find rewarding and challenging is doing work between fields. Where someone in one field will ask you a question because you're the one person that they know who's in that other field too. And then sometimes you can connect people and they can do meaningful work. Or I work as an academic under peer review and I try to write papers in a lot of different fields. So I get to see a wide variety of reviewers too, who are like, how dare you? Here are the gatekeeping parameters of this field. And you're like, oh, okay, get in line. There are 10 of you in different fields. And I think that that's interesting. It's not super pleasant, but trying to build those connections, there's something I find very heartening about it, the way that I find it heartening to travel.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a couple of things that came up that reminded me of things that I think we try to communicate in a good MBA program. And one of them is this capacity to go macroscopic and microscopic, right? Understanding when you need to kind of get in the weeds and when you need to kind of pull back and see the big picture, right? When you need to delegate and when you have to do stuff yourself. And you use this term, the custom generalist, right? Which is a generalist that has a unique portfolio of attributes and skills.
Yeah, no, I love that being a generalist doesn't mean that you are the ether. It just means that you have your own particular remit that's self-designed and doesn't have to fit exactly in a silo.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, part of this is about art thinking, but I think part of it is also about being a specific type of manager. There's a lot in there on leadership, and you use this term from good enough mother. I remember that actually. I remember reading that actually.
Yeah.
it was from I think it was from the 50s or something, right?
And before, yeah.
Yeah.
You're right. You're exactly right. Right around that time. Yeah. 40,
so if someone were to ask you, well, what does that have to do with being a manager? What would you say?
Yeah. Well, so we talked a little bit about this idea of the heroic manager, right? Name on the masthead, kind of the Steve Jobs position. And I think that there's also this role for what in the book is called the good enough manager. And this comes from, or I adapted it from, Donald Woods Winnicott, the British child psychologist who studied children who were separated from their families during World War II. And what he found was that they didn't need perfect parenting. They needed what Winnicott called a good enough mother, which means that the child could have the illusion of oneness with the parent and then go through a natural separation process, and that what they needed was what Winnicott called a holding environment. They needed an environment in which they felt safe to explore. And one of the core criteria of a holding environment is that it's possible to repair. So I think about this a lot. Like, you don't need this perfect workplace where everyone, looks like they jumped out of an Apple ad from 2010. You need a place where there's the capacity to kind of check in and say, hey, this isn't working, but then to play through, not grievance politics, but to play through and to repair. And that capacity for repair and knowing that you have the future capacity for repair creates this kind of trust that's part of leading creative teams.
Well, I think that the story I heard was, kids will wander off and go and explore, and then periodically they'll just kind of look over their shoulder and see that their mom is there, and then that kind of emboldens them to continue, right? So
yeah.
Knowing that they have, and so, in a workforce where I guess you feel safe enough that you can fail, that your experiments might not go where you want them to go, and it's not a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's
it's
a big
sort
part of it.
I think what Piaget called a secure attachment, if I'm remembering that correctly. And this idea that you can ask for help, this idea that you don't have to be cards close to the vest waiting to claim credit for the finished product, like as some workplaces encourage people to be. This trust that your colleagues will credit your contribution, and that you can find something to work on that's bigger than all of you and that requires all of you. I think that's the promise of it.
Well, I think you also introduced this distinction between a guru and a guide.
Yeah.
Right? What's the problem with a guru?
There's a quotation in the book that you might have at the tip of your brain more than I do, but it's from Kirk Barnadoe, the curator at the Museum of Modern Art, who passed away, and an obituary that was written about him by Adam Gopnik in the New Yorker. And he basically says a guru gives us himself and his expertise, and a guide gives us his subject and ourselves. I'm not quoting that perfectly, but I think there's an idea that a guru is kind of performing expertise and it's about the guru, and a guide is sharing knowledge so that other people can be transformed by their own education and find their own reserves and move forward as a group. I have this very specific memory of the first time I ever went camping in Yosemite. I was on an REI trip, and we happened to have this guy, Gary, who's the head REI guide. Some of your listeners might know who this is. Legend, as are all the REI guides I've ever had in Yosemite. But I remember the particular way he watched me try to put a tent together. It's like he wasn't hovering in a helicopter parent way, and he wasn't jumping in unsolicitedly to help me do it. He was like letting me have what you just described, Greg, like that kind of longer tether. But he was there if I needed him. And he wasn't like, yeah, you really messed that up, let me jump in. He just was like, oh yeah, this goes this way, that goes that way. To me, it's a kind of structural parenting or structural managing. And it's a theme that came up for me a little bit earlier. So maybe I'll have a chance to say it on two levels. I think a lot of times we assume a motivation and things, we approach them as a vector, and I think they're just a structure. Like markets, for example, we approach it as a vector. We're like, this is all about profit maximization and success and leading toward this goal. And I think of it much more as a structure. Like, this is an algebra. This will help you, whatever it is you're trying to do in life, it will help you make it structurally sound. If you're an artist, it will make it sustainable. And if you create upside, it doesn't mean that you're a profit-seeking monster or just a profit seeker full stop. It just means that structurally you created surplus, and you should own a share of the value that you helped to create. It's incredibly simple, and it's just structural. And I think that there's a huge place within creative work, and I think about this within teaching too, for being structural and not judgmental. So in the book, it's called discernment as opposed to judgment. Just going like, hey, here's what I'm noticing. And thinking about things in this kind of like if-then statement way, not like Amy's bad at putting a tent together, but like, well, the principle that you need here is this. So see if you can put that into place. Or if a student comes to talk to me about a project and they're like, I want to do this thing, I'm not going to say, you can't do that because it's hard to get the data. I'm going to say, well, if you want to do that, the challenge is how to get the data. So like, how would you think about how to get the data? You know, I've never figured that out, but maybe you can. And I think some of those things are aspects of this type of management that's very empowering. That's a bit more of the kind of judo and not karate of managerial style, a bit more kind of channeling the energy through. And benefiting from the whole team.
Yeah, I mean, you implicitly made a comparison or an analogy between being a manager and being a teacher. You know, you just kind of slid from, you know, and there was some stuff in the book about, you know, crits, right? So all of our I have plenty of friends who are artists, and I remember in college when the crits would come down from New York to Philadelphia. You know, they'd come down on the Amtrak, they'd come in, waltz in, and start, you know, doing all their crits, and then jump back on the Amtrak. And, you know, I think you say there's kind of better and worse ways to do this. But I'm wondering, I mean, the bigger question is the extent to which these attributes are contagious. I mean, if you are someone who is using the art thinking framework and as a leader, I think what you're implying is that this will effectively create a group of people who also will adopt that framework. So as an art thinking leader, it's not like you are instrumenting the people in the organization to you know, implement your vision, but rather you are creating like kind of miniature art thinking people, right, to go along, right? Yeah. Is that it? Is there an infectiousness or contagiousness?
I like that. It's less scarce resource, again, in this kind of guru Steve Jobs archetype way, and it's more let's get a network externality going here. You know, let's create enough of a culture and a critical mass that we have this kind of collective ability.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's another metaphor. I mean, the book is filled with metaphors. There was a metaphor you used, which is like, the figure and the ground. And this seemed to me to be partially about attention, right? And how you utilize attention, both in microscopically and macroscopically. What can we learn from how artists think about sort of figure and ground?
Yeah. So I mean, first of all, thanks for noticing that the book is full of metaphors. Also, sorry if anyone is listening who knows me personally, they're like, yeah, Whitaker uses a lot of metaphors. That's a thing. And I would be the first to say they're not all gold, except I did have the benefit of writing and editing that book. So I only left the good ones, I think. But figure and ground in an artistic sense, and that's in the part of the book that's kind of mindsets of art, is the idea, if you picture a Van Gogh painting of flowers in a vase on a table, the flowers in the vase are the figure and the table in the background are the ground. So markets tend to get us to over focus on the figure and under focus on the ground. There's a kind of the famous David Foster Wallace story about the fish who are swimming, and one of them says to the other, the water's nice today, and the other fish goes, what's water? That's a kind of example of not seeing the ground that we're operating in. And I think one of the mindsets of art is kind of focusing on the whole composition and not over focusing on the figure. Some of the most interesting artworks, a lot of what makes them interesting and dynamic is the way that the figure breaks the edges of the ground. If you are in a museum the next time it's something I notice as a painter who's always like, how do they make that? How do they take that blank page and make it come alive? It's often the way something goes off an edge or is off center. And it's a question of just kind of how to think more holistically.
Yeah, I was an art minor in college, and of course, what I took away from those classes, there's obviously the ability to appreciate images and objects, right? Of course, but I think there's a broader set of insights that you get from taking classes in art. One of which is related to figure and ground. I mean, I remember my teacher said, "Look, the viewer is going to spend 90% of the time looking at the face, and they're not going to spend any time looking at the floor. But you, as an artist, have to be just as intentional about that square centimeter of floor in the lower left-hand corner of the painting as you do about the eyeballs, at the center." And that was profoundly impactful for me in all sorts of other domains. And I remember there's another class where we had we had 5 days, 15 hours to work on this painting. And I had been working on it for about 12 of those 15 hours. And it just never got any better. And finally, the instructor came up to me and said, "Look, what do you think about the drawing here that's beneath the painting?" And I was like, it's not quite right. He said, "Well, why do you keep trying to fix it with color?" And so he took the palette knife. He said, "Just let me do this." And he took the palette knife and he just scraped all of the paint off.
Wow.
Wiped out 12 hours of my work and said,
"Oh my God,
why don't you just start over?" And within an hour, I'd already gotten to a place that was better than I had, in the previous 12 hours. And I knew that he had spent those 12 hours just watching me dig myself deeper and deeper into this hole. And only after 12 hours decided to, kind of come in and intervene. And I just remember, like, forget about painting. I mean, that's just such an important lesson around sunk cost, and, and everything else.
Yeah, that's an amazing story. I hope he asked your consent at some point before he put his paintbrush on your canvas, except palette knife. So bulldozer of equivalent to a paintbrush. That is so relatable and also such a wild story. I definitely remember a number of those moments, a teacher coming over and you're like, "I think it's done," and just kind of shaking his head no, like once, and then walking away. Or that moment of starting over, it's part of why I loved oil painting, is because you could go back without taking all the paint off. Like, you could go back and keep layering it on. Like, there was the possibility of the, awkward adolescent phase of the painting, and then for it to come all the way through, and for the earlier things to stay there. But I think for me, like, there's something in what you're saying where, like, in my experience making work, where sometimes, like, you just can't really shut off the judgmental part of your brain, and you're like, this is great. This is going great. Like, this is a great drawing. Thank goodness. I'm so relieved. I'm managing the anxiety of trying to make something great, But almost every time I have had that thought, I look at it later and I almost can't look at the drawing, and I have to set it aside and do it again. It's the ones where, while I'm making the drawing, I'm not in control of it, and I'm completely in the work. And it is the feeling of spilling water on a flat table and trying to contain it with your hands, where you're like, you're just completely present to the work. I think getting the drawing right before you start doing the painting is a different thing. And I think, we've all been there. There's that other metaphor in the book of the easel and the armchair, that it's very hard kind of to be at the easel making work and then to back up. You can't see how it's going when you're making it. Sometimes you have to back up, but if you're sitting in the armchair in the studio, you can't see it. And I definitely remember that, where you're like, oh, her leg is not connected to her body. That's so interesting. I'm gonna have to work on that, kind of to your point. But I think the experience of making studio art is very profound. It sounds like, to how both of us kind of go through the world. And I think especially in a day and age where you don't have to draw, you can, generate images that are only based on images that have been made before through, generative AI. I think how we learn to think in this way, it is a pretty urgent question.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the bigger question is, does it make sense to have classes in things like studio art for people who have absolutely zero intention of becoming studio artists? I mean, it seems like our philosophy of education, you talked about STEM and STEAM. I think was that John Maeda who came up with that?
Yeah.
Right. But I mean, a lot of times I think our view of education is, if it's not entirely directly useful, we shouldn't waste time teaching it. And maybe one other reason why we might teach is just to find out if people are good at it. And if they're good at it, then yeah, they keep going. And if they're not good at it, then boom, stop doing it. But I think there are reasons why people might want to do things, and the learnings are not immediately obvious. They sort of work their way into other domains indirectly.
Yeah, I mean, completely. I think there's a real instrumentalization of art education, where people say art's good because it teaches you to make better scores on your math tests, and art's good because you won an award for it, and we can tell a very tidy story about that. But I think of art as a process, and one of my favorite, of many equally favorite, children in the book, one of my other favorite case studies in the art thinking book is about the senior reflection seminar at Stanford that Sue McConnell and Andrew Todd Hunter teach. So Stanford's very famous for having an arts initiative, which is really interesting. It's great that there's a cross-university arts initiative. A huge amount of respect for it. This is also a seminar that's taught to life science majors by a neurobiologist and a writer. And it's just an art process seminar. The syllabus says that it's strongly encouraged that you buy onesie pajamas to wear to class. People are like doing planking under the table. Like it's very much a space in which you trust that everyone has worked so hard to be in the room and worked so hard in all of their other science classes that this is complementary to, right? This is the flexibility to the strength. So yeah, I think that we should have art classes. I think maybe we don't have them because there's a kind of technocratic desire to measure the outcomes. And some of that comes from a good place of wanting there to be equity across educational opportunities, wanting to make sure people are at grade level. But I think, again, in that alternative asset allocation way, like we can afford to have a class where people are learning to think, and they're learning to think in part not only through drawing a still life, but through world building, through diagramming and thinking visually and spatially about the world we want to live in, and through observing the world as it is. And those are the first classes to get cut, the same way that the 20% time easily goes by the wayside. In my ideal world, the arts is seen as a hub for interdisciplinary problem solving. And it is the home for connection points across universities. And it's not the elective course that you take in high school or grade school, although it can be, that it's threaded through everything and that people have a chance to make things. I'm constantly inspired when I am asked to speak in universities, in other disciplines, in companies, wherever it is. I am constantly inspired by how broadly distributed creativity is in the world, and how absolutely rigorous and creative people are. And I'm always moved by the people I meet who could easily have been artists in the day of Leonardo. They're gifted photorealist painters who go into asset management. I think, we have to assume that everyone is an artist and that everyone has the potential to be an artist. And I think that sort of dignity position has a lot of legs for us in terms of what our society can do and what it means to have real sustainable value creation in our economy. I think it also is the most hopeful thing that I can come up with regard to the body politic as well.
Well, you've also written quite a bit about the economics of the art market and the technology of the art markets. And, in this book, the NFT book, I had not thought about this, but you talked about NSILOed and how he had come up with this idea that you could monetize or sell sort of the ownership of a piece separate from the piece, right? Or the almost like the instruction set, or the and I think other artists, like I think Maurizio Cattelan has done something similar, and so this is sort of at least the intellectual foundations for what we now call NFTs.
I was really lucky to write that book. It came out in 2023. I co-wrote it with Nora Burnett Abrams, who's the director of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver. And she and I did this public program series at MCA Denver that's online, and was really a lot of fun, and then had always thought that it might be a book. So the book starts with NSILOed. Nora's an art historian, and I've always been kind of in love with NSILOed's work. I had to do a project on him in college. And he very famously said once, I think it's the idea becomes a machine that makes the art. He was very interested in market critiques of art. He was very interested in the democratic access to art. And in the late 1960s, he made his first wall drawing where he made a set of instructions for a drawing, and the instructions were the work, and then the work was executed on the wall. And he executed a lot of the early ones himself, but over time there became this group of artisans, draftspeople who made the work. There's a wonderful something like 25-year retrospective of his work that's up at the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art in North Adams for I think another 10 or 15 years if you have the chance. LeWitt's wall drawings are famous in the arts because if I own one and I have the drawing on my wall, but I sell it to you and I transfer the certificate to you with the instructions, I no longer have a silhouette. I technically have a drawing on my wall, but that drawing is not a silhouette. So when people started to get interested in NFTs, you could say, I own.
And the corollary to that is that if someone were to, who bought the certificate, were to replicate it on their wall, then that would become
a silhouette. But even if they never put the drawing on their wall, they own the silhouette. The instructions. And when he first made those works, they were just the instructions. It was later over time that he formalized them into certificates of authenticity. And there are a lot of works where silhouette tried to say how they should operate and what the instructions were, where people ignored him. He has a set of drawings where they're not to be sold for more than $100, and they're definitely sold for more than $100. So, win some, lose some, I guess. So I've always been interested in blockchain because I thought blockchain was a way of registering shares for artists if they retained partial equity in their work. And it's a way of sharing upside and registering the sharing of upside in creative work.
Well, right. So with the smart contracts, you can effectively implement the droit de suite, which are extremely difficult to implement in the legal system.
Yeah, so this droit de suite resale royalties that are specified in, I think, 70 or so jurisdictions worldwide, where artists receive a percentage of the price when their work resells. Secondarily, I started doing some research on whether it was possible to do that privately through retained equity shares. So not a governmentally sponsored kind of surcharge on the art, but an actual equity share that the artist held. And I thought these equity shares were interesting under the Coase theorem because they're property rights that can be traded any time. And about 5 minutes after I thought about that, I was introduced to Sean Moss-Boltz, who was founding a blockchain company called Bitmark. And I was like, whoa, this is like 2014. I was like, wow, you could really put these together. So blockchain is related to, but a bit different from NFTs. I mean, NFTs are unique digital identifiers registered to a blockchain, but the way they've taken off in the arts is in parallel to, but also different from many of the possibilities of blockchain. But Lewitt was really instrumental, I think, as an analogy when NFTs came to the fore with the Beeple sale, the $69 million NFT sale in the spring of 2021, and people started to really pay attention. It was like the whole front page of the Wall Street Journal above the fold. That is like, or at least not unlike a Lewitt, because Metakovan, who bought the work, owns the certificate of authenticity. You or I could easily own, and I do somewhere, the high-res JPEG of that work. It's like, which is equivalent to having the drawing on my wall, but not owning the work.
Yeah, but I think it's still kind of cool and maybe puzzling that we value one version of something that is almost identical to another by dramatically more because it is official or original or, has been touched by the artist's hand and so forth, right? I mean, that's the thing that's kind of unique about art. I mean, if we're talking about a wrench and you make a wrench that is identical, I'm going to value them equally, right? But if you have a painting and a carbon copy of the painting, the carbon copy is worth so much less.
Yeah, because you're really valuing the moment of doing it kind of unspotted by proof that someone's done it before.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are all sorts of new business models. You talk about Christo. I mean, Christo pioneered I think, a fascinating business model because the thing that he creates, he and his wife create, is ephemeral, right? It comes and goes, but he's still able to monetize the event through the sale of all these artifacts.
Yeah. That's a really interesting case. I actually was teaching Christo and Jean-Claude in class last night because we were shifting from talking about artists as producers to talking about investment. It's this broad survey class. But you could say that they monetized ephemeral projects by selling drawings, but I think of it almost as well the other way around, because they sold the drawings in order to have the money to self-invest in doing the ephemeral projects. Today is actually the 3rd anniversary of the Arc de Triomphe, which was like a semi-posthumous work. They wrapped the Arc de Triomphe in something like 25,000 meters of fabric and red rope, September 18th, 2021. And they first had the idea to do that work in 1961. So they spent that much time thinking about it. We know other works of theirs, like they wrapped the Reichstag in Berlin. They erected 7,503 big saffron orange metal gates with billowing fabric in Central Park in 2005. Those projects they had the idea for in the 70s, but it took them that long to fundraise for them. And so I think it's in part because Christo didn't want to take money from grant makers. Like he didn't want to take outside investment. He wanted to do it himself. It's through this kind of cross subsidy, right? So I would imagine that they were able to make money to live on, and maybe they profited. I don't know. I think there's a kind of cultural, I'm not suggesting that you're weighing on this or leaning on this, but I think there's this kind of cultural archetype of like, well, artists shouldn't make money. You know, they should be like a profit capped arm of our society. And I think it's perfectly fine for artists to make money if they figured out how to do it, in the same way that I don't think it's my job to have an opinion about other people making money. I think, I have a bit more of an opinion if it's OpenAI, and I think that they're using creative output, that they're relying on value they didn't help to create. And that it may be hard to see that because, for example, Sarah Silverman or John Grisham, their work is a tiny drop in the pool of what goes in. But still, it means that all of us together helped seed it, and it's basically taking a public resource and privatizing it. And I think that's happening in a lot of other cases. And that in the last chapter of the story of NFTs, Nora and I write about the idea, the Clarissa Towson, this artist who had a show at MCA Denver a couple of years ago, had made these beautiful giant tapestries that look like the surface of the moon, because she was so interested in the feeling of public ownership of the space age. And I'm sure it's possible to have, nostalgia about that that's rose-colored. But even still, I think we forget sometimes how privatized public works are now, and how much we live at a time of what Will Davies, who is my PhD advisor, calls the disenchantment of politics by economics. We don't realize how much our society has been fracked by economic interests. And I say that as a person who believes in markets, same as what Winston Churchill said about democracy. They're the worst there is except for all the others, right? I think, markets can be magnificent, but I think this is a particular time where we really have to think about those models and think about collective models differently. Think about how to have political systems where people's voice is not overweighted by their economic interest, and how to have economic systems where there's as much participation as is possible. Not always perfectly possible. And I absolutely respect that there are people who are taking concentrated risks and, would necessarily structurally receive concentrated rewards. But I think there's a kind of fetishization. I love to use that word because I can almost not say it. There is a fetishization of technological progress that has served us for a long time. But I think we are maybe needing to spend more time looking at some of the costs of that. Walk down the sidewalk in New York and count the number of people who are looking at their phones. And I think you start to get the tiny tip of the iceberg of the answer to that question.
Well, last question. I think it was about 15 years ago that Daniel Pink said that the MFA is the new MBA. and you were involved in an interesting hybrid of the two here in the CCA in San Francisco, sort of the arts MBA. But I haven't heard people say that lately. I mean, was that a specific moment? I mean, what do you think there's still some merit in that idea that that we need to rethink the MBA? I mean, you did both, but should we be thinking about something that's maybe a hybrid of the two?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to talk with you about this, particularly, Greg, because I think you and I are fellow travelers in this kind of generalist question and this melding of business and art. I think when Daniel Pink says the MFA is the new MBA on a list of big ideas in the Harvard Business Review, you can think of it as, from the vantage point of business, art is something that would be helpful to include, as opposed to you should really get an MFA as a replacement for an MBA. I mean, I just thought it was funny at the time because they were such different cultural experiences. I mean, I owned a Navy interview suit in business school that I felt uncomfortable enough wearing that I wore it as a flight attendant costume for Halloween. And I looked down in an interview and there's duct tape residue from where I'd put the wings. When I started art school, so there, and I think I might have actually written this in the book, and it probably sounds better on the page, but you walk up the stairs and there's a banana just sitting there and someone has written in ballpoint pen, "Please put me in your ass." Excuse my French, listeners, I'm sorry to burn your ears. And you're like, this is definitely not something that happened to me in business school. And I spend a lot of time, I think it's good practice to, not have to be what people think we are when we walk into rooms, but I walk into rooms in finance where people are like, oh, it's the art historian who was pouring everybody water at dinner, or it's the art lady, and that's totally fine. Or I walk into faculty meetings in the art department and someone's like, oh, I'm surprised you're interested in that, or I thought you were only interested in markets. And so I think that that speaks maybe more to kind of disciplinary politics of academia, but I think that the design MBA program at CCA is such a beautiful model because it's that like a three-legged stool, right? Of economics or business as one leg, design or creative process as another, and then the environment, which is to say systems and context as the third. And it was a pleasure to teach students in that program who were such makers and thinkers, and you could have published the graphic design in their, economics take-home exams in Microsoft Word. But I think also, I encounter inspiring and curious students in all of those rooms. And if I just sort of ignore that someone's like, oh, who brought the Marxist one day and who brought the rapacious capitalist the next, I think, I'm interested in stitching those things together. I'm interested in finding and learning about the experience of people in other parts of the country and other parts of the world. I'm interested in finding the places where they're saying the same things in really different language. And I always appreciate the curiosity of the people who invite me in. And I'm always made to think by them. I'll be like in a finance class talking about provenance in the arts, and someone will ask a question and you're like, yeah, the logical conclusion of that question is that the entire market would flow through your LLC. What a privilege to have that thought experiment. But I think for me, the intersections of art and business are inherently political. They're lowercase p political in terms of how much you think the market should come into art, and they're big P political in terms of questions of who gets to decide and participate and become an artist. And I think maybe that idea of citizen, of being a creative person, an economic actor, and a citizen is the kind of whole picture of it.
Well, Amy, thanks so much for joining me. We talked mostly about this whole book called Art Thinking. Check it out. But also, we got a book on NFTs. And if you're interested in economics of visual art, definitely check this one out. So thanks so much. We'll talk again soon.
I'm very honored. Thanks so much for having me.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.